In the last episode, we talked about the justifications for the creation of empires in the second half of the 19th century, the why of the imperial project and mindset. In this episode, we're going to talk about the how. Of course, some of the important hows were also addressed in the last episode when I spoke about the new industrialized technologies of the West, like steamships and Maxim guns and new communication technologies. But in this episode, I want to get into a few specifics of places where it happened and analyze how it happened with you. So in today's video, we're going to talk about India, the Congo, the Pacific, Africa as a whole, and the American West. For the first half of the 18th century, the British East India Company had started to increase its access to the markets of India. For example, in 1717, the BEIC had bribed their way into a Farman, we're going to use this other word later, or imperial decree from the Mughal emperor at the time that enabled them to trade duty-free in India in return for a small annual fee. Other agreements between the Mughal rulers further divided India as local, often Hindu princes resented the Mughal decisions. This is something that the British will continue to exploit and provoke internal conflicts. From 1756 to 1757, a number of disputes over the right of the British East India Company to build forts in Bengal, which was India's most industrial and richest region, turned into one of the most important turning points in Indian and possibly British history. One of the forts, or Fort William, shown here, had been captured by the Bengali prince and then recaptured by the British by a man named Robert Clive. After hearing that the French had promised to help the Bengali prince finally kick out the British, Robert Clive is able to use his cunning to convince the generals of the Bengali army to turn against their prince and throw Clive the battle. The Bengali general, Mir Jafar, betrays the Bengali prince at the Battle of Plassey. This battle ends up gaining the BEIC a Diwani, which is basically an imperial decree, from the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. This Diwani enables the company to collect taxes over the 10 million Bengalis who live there, which essentially makes them the de facto ruler of the province. According to historian Nick Robbins, Bengal, which soon accounted for 50% of the company's profits, suffered greatly under BEIC rule. Millions of people died from famine due to their policies, market restrictions, and lack of disaster relief. Despite waging wars with other princes to conquer the rest of India, the British Parliament continued to grow increasingly critical of the BEIC and the reports it was receiving from India. This concern reached a boiling point after what is intermittently known as the Sepoy Rebellion, the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the First Indian War of Independence, and other names. So let's dig into how it happened. BEIC policies towards Indians were not great. There was rampant discrimination, dismissal of Indian literature, culture, and tradition, and laws were passed that were seen as insensitive, even bordering on insulting. According to British historian of India, William Dalrymple, whose ancestor was actually one of the BEIC governors of India, one British administrator of India wrote that, quote, "A single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." Yikes. I guess we just don't care about one of the oldest religious texts ever published, the Vedas, which is from India. I wonder what the Europeans were writing when that came out. Oh, right. Not a whole lot. I mean, maybe some Mycenaean Linear B or Cretan Linear A if we're lucky, but no literature to speak of. So basically, overall, many Indians felt their culture was under siege, and this included the sepoys, who were Indian soldiers serving the company. No matter how competent or experienced they were, no Indian soldiers could be promoted to major positions of power. They always served under British officers. High caste sepoys were insulted serving under British officers, and also if they were asked to transfer overseas, it was a threat to their status and their caste. It was seen as almost irreligious to transfer them overseas. Furthermore, new laws were passed forcing the Indians who died without a, quote, direct heir to give their property to the British. So in 1857, to top off all this tension, a rumor started to go through the sepoy ranks that the new musket cartridge that was being introduced would force sepoys to rip open the cartridge with their mouths. And the cartridge was actually greased with pig and cow fat. So this would not be cool. It would not be cool if you were Hindu or if you were Muslim. Hindus hold cows sacred and Muslims are forbidden from eating pigs. So it was really seen as just another arrogant and culturally ignorant policy. Even though, like, last minute, the British were able to recall these cartridges and never actually issue them to the sepoys, it definitely ignited a fury that had lain dormant within their ranks. Soon after the refusal of some sepoys to follow these orders to touch what they feared were these kind of offending cartridges, the sepoys mutinied, and this uprising then spilled over into a general uprising throughout Bengal. The uprising, though, lacked clear leadership, and so it escalated into violence against civilians throughout India, which the British responded to in kind. British women and children and Indian women and children suffered murder and mutilation because both sides continued to escalate the violence. Finally, the British were able to put down the revolt and exile the last Mughal emperor to Burma. They did this because he had been used as a rallying cry by the rebels. The BEIC, however, treated captured rebel Indian troops barbarically, and because of this, Parliament passed the Government of India Act of 1858 and transferred all power from the BEIC to the British government, and Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. A similar string of events takes place in the Congo. Starting in the 1880s, Belgian explorers had started gaining a foothold in the remarkably resource-rich area of Central Africa called the Congo. At an event generously hosted by Otto von Bismarck in the new German capital of Berlin, the European heads of state met to discuss rules for dividing Africa in a way that would ensure the most beneficial distribution of the region without causing any violence. Well, between Europeans anyway. This was called the Berlin Conference, and it happened over the winter of 1884 to 1885. And of course, you guessed it, African societies and leaders, let alone average people, were definitely not invited. Anyway, one of the major decisions made at the conference was that the Congo Free State would go to King Leopold II of Belgium. The Congo Free State would be ruled as a, quote, personal concession to King Leopold. So it was actually his personally owned territory. It was not land that was governed or managed by the Belgian government. Without any oversight and never bothering to actually set foot there, King Leopold's rapacious rubber collecting policies and outright greed resulted in the deaths of millions of Congolese from abuse, starvation, and execution until the Belgian government, with the help of British and American journalists, finally forced Leopold to hand over the colony to the government. In other places in Africa, charter companies like the Royal Niger Company or the British South Africa Company employed missionaries to help them gain footholds with African leaders and then eventually used treaties, trade agreements, or often unscrupulous policies to move Africans off valuable land and gain political control. In the Pacific, disease often played a larger role than it did in Africa. Many Pacific islands were remote and didn't have a lot of contact with outsiders. After the arrival of Europeans in Hawaii, for example, the population shrinks from approximately 700,000 to under 100,000. Like in the Americas, this enabled Europeans and, in the case of Hawaii and the rest of the Pacific, eventually Americans, to take advantage of any internal rivalries, weaken monarchies, and establish puppet rulers or just take outright control. But why, right? Like, if these islands are in the middle of nowhere and are basically just pretty islands, why did Europeans, Americans, and later Japanese even want them? Well, they're great refueling points for our new fancy steamship navies that are being built, and some of them even had fantastic supplies of guano, which is bird or bat droppings, and are very high in nitrogen, and therefore they make great fertilizer for the new industrialized agriculture in the West. So that's why the Pacific Islands matter. Or, if it's Hawaii, it's pineapples. It's all about the pineapples. I'll link to some of the best podcasts I've heard about the American takeover of Hawaii, and I read a fabulous book called How to Hide an Empire that outlines the U.S. experience in the Philippines and elsewhere, but I also want to take some time to talk about American westward expansion. In sub-Saharan Africa, I mentioned how the British, French, Germans, and others often used treaties and trade agreements to push native Africans off their land. In South Africa, the British go even further and create what are called Bantustans, or reservations for black Africans. This should sound remarkably familiar. A similar process is used to remove Native Americans from their land and open it up for primarily white settlement. And many historians now see the manifest destiny we proudly discuss in our elementary school history classes as part of the larger trend of the state expanding to create an empire. For the United States and Russia, this empire is built over contiguous land, later on islands as well, right, as we can see here. Like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, but it generally happens in a similar fashion. Forts are built, treaties between unequally armed parties are formed, skirmishes allow for justifiable breaking of those treaties, and land is taken anyway. You can draw conclusions for yourself about who started the skirmishes or whether or not the treaties were made with the intent to keep them. There are a lot of historical analyses on the topic, but what remains historically accurate is that the second half of the 19th century is when the United States built an empire using similar techniques to the British and the Russians. When it comes to the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. And trying to play power politics on a world stage often requires the remodeling of some of your nation's most basic principles. Thanks for watching.